Why bronze swords weren't as weak as you think. Here's something most people get completely wrong about ancient warfare. When you imagine a Bronze Age soldier lifting his sword, maybe 1200 BC, somewhere in the Eastern Mediterranean, you probably picture a flimsy, soft metal weapon that bends on impact. Something that belonged to a more primitive era. Something that iron replaced because iron was simply better. That assumption is wrong, and the evidence that demolishes it has been sitting in museums for decades. Bronze swords didn't just work. In the right hands, under the right conditions, they were devastating, and in some critical ways, they were superior to the iron weapons that supposedly made them obsolete. This is the story of one of history's most misunderstood weapons, and what it actually tells us about the people who built civilizations with it. Bronze has an image problem, and it mostly comes from us. We live in an age of steel, an age where we know instinctively that iron is harder and stronger than copper. And since bronze is an alloy of copper and tin, we assume it exists somewhere below iron on the hierarchy of toughness. We think of it as a stepping stone, a placeholder material on the way to something better. But metallurgy isn't that simple, and ancient smiths knew things we tend to underestimate. First, let's establish what bronze actually is. Bronze is copper combined with roughly 10 to 12% tin. That combination, discovered independently in multiple cultures around 3000 BC, created a material that transformed human civilization. It was harder than pure copper, easier to cast into complex shapes than almost any metal available at the time, and when worked correctly, it held an edge remarkably well. The other thing to understand is that ancient smiths weren't guessing. By the time bronze sword-making reached its peak, roughly 1600 to 1200 BC in the Mediterranean, Europe, and the Near East, these craftsmen had been refining their techniques for over 1,000 years. They understood heat treatment. They understood how to work-harden the blade's edges by cold hammering them. They understood alloy ratios. This wasn't primitive metallurgy. It was precise metallurgy, just practiced with different tools than ours. Here's where it gets genuinely interesting, and where the conventional story starts falling apart. When we say iron is harder than bronze, we need to be careful. There are different kinds of hardness, and they matter differently in a sword fight. Hardness is a material's resistance to being scratched or dented. Toughness is its ability to absorb impact without fracturing. In a blade, you need both, but an excess of one without the other is catastrophic. Early iron swords, and this is the part that rarely gets mentioned, were often worse than bronze. Not harder iron, not steel, early iron. The iron that first replaced bronze in most ancient militaries was wrought iron, which is actually softer than a well-made bronze sword. It bent. It lost its edge faster. It was more difficult to cast into clean, complex shapes. Bronze, by contrast, has a specific property that metallurgists find fascinating. It work-hardens. When you hammer bronze cold, the crystalline structure of the metal compresses and tightens. Ancient smiths used this deliberately. They would cast the rough blade, then cold hammer the edges, increasing their hardness specifically at the cutting surface, while leaving the core of the blade slightly more flexible. This is not a primitive workaround. This is engineered design. There's also the question of resonance. Bronze has excellent damping properties. It absorbs vibration rather than transmitting it entirely to the hand. For a soldier fighting for hours, this matters. A sword that doesn't numb your grip after repeated impacts is a sword that keeps you alive longer. And then there's the edge geometry, because bronze could be cast into shapes that iron initially could not. Bronze Age smiths produced blades with elaborate profiles that distributed stress intelligently. The leaf-shaped swords of the European Bronze Age, the Irish Ballintober type, the Aegean Naue too, weren't just beautiful. Their widest point near the tip created a forward weight balance ideal for slashing cuts, while their narrow base near the hilt improved maneuverability. These were designed objects, not stumbled upon. Let's talk about the people who actually used these swords, because understanding the weapon requires understanding the warfare. Bronze Age combat in the Mediterranean world was not primarily an infantry slog. Elite warriors in Mycenaean Greece, in the Hittite Empire, in ancient Egypt, they fought in a way that was fundamentally different from the grinding, close-quarters infantry battles of the later Iron Age. Chariot warfare dominated. Raiding dominated. Individual warrior prestige dominated. In that context, a sword wasn't the first weapon you reached for. It was the last weapon. Spears, javelins, bows, those did most of the killing at distance. The sword was your sidearm, your close-quarters backup, your prestige object. This changes how we evaluate bronze swords entirely. We shouldn't be asking, could a bronze sword survive the same abuse as an iron one? We should be asking, was this sword well suited for the role it was actually expected to play? And the answer is unambiguously yes. The famous bronze swords found in Mycenaean shaft graves, some dating to the 16th century BC, are works of extraordinary craftsmanship. The Type A rapiers, over a meter long, were clearly designed for thrusting, for getting inside an opponent's guard and ending the fight quickly. Later, shorter Type B swords favored slashing. Different tactical doctrines produced different blade geometries, all in bronze, all functional for their intended purpose. Experimental archaeologists, researchers who actually make and test these weapons, have confirmed this repeatedly. A full-length bronze sword, cast and hammered to historical specifications, will thrust through leather or bronze scale armor with alarming ease. The edge holds through dozens of cuts on suitable targets before any meaningful degradation. The blade flexes under impact without shattering. These aren't decorative objects. They're weapons that could, and did, kill people effectively. So if bronze was this effective, why did iron replace it? The standard answer, because iron is better, is an oversimplification that obscures one of the most important turning points in human history. Around 1200 BC, the Bronze Age world collapsed. And we mean collapsed. The Mycenaean palaces burned. The Hittite Empire disintegrated. Trade networks that had connected Egypt, the Levant, Greece, and Anatolia for centuries went silent. Egyptian texts record invaders from the sea. Linear B, the script of Mycenaean Greece, went extinct. Cities were abandoned. The population of the Eastern Mediterranean may have dropped by as much as 50%. This is called the Late Bronze Age collapse, and historians still debate its causes. But one consequence was devastatingly clear. The supply chains that made bronze possible were shattered. Bronze required tin, and tin, unlike copper, was not widely available. The tin that fed Bronze Age metalworking traveled extraordinary distances, from Afghanistan, from Anatolia, from Cornwall in Britain, from Central Europe, across hundreds and sometimes thousands of miles of sea and overland routes. Routes that, by 1200 BC, had ceased to function. Iron ore, by contrast, is found almost everywhere. You don't need long-distance trade to get iron. You need a furnace and skill. When the networks that supplied tin collapsed, the practical incentive to develop iron technology became overwhelming, not because iron was metallurgically superior, but because iron was available. Early iron workers eventually learned to produce steel, iron with controlled carbon content. And when they did, that steel was unambiguously harder and more durable than bronze. But this took time. For generations after bronze gave way, iron weapons were actually inferior in performance. The transition happened for logistical and economic reasons first. Performance came later. This means that when you see a bronze sword in a museum and instinctively think primitive, you are projecting a very modern assumption onto an ancient object. The people who made those swords weren't waiting for something better. They had built and refined the best weapons their material world could produce. There's a final dimension to bronze swords that goes beyond the purely physical, and it matters more than we usually acknowledge. Bronze, unlike iron, was sacred. In cultures across the Bronze Age world, the ability to produce bronze was associated with divine craft. Hephaestus in Greek myth, Goibniu in Celtic tradition, the divine smith was a figure of enormous power and mystery. The forge was a place of transformation, where raw earth became something that could kill, or build, or outlast human lives. Bronze swords were buried with kings. They were offered to rivers and lakes. Hundreds have been recovered from bodies of water across Europe, placed there deliberately as offerings. They were engraved, gilded, given names, treated as entities with their own agency. The sword was not merely a tool. It was a symbol of the ordered world, of the warrior's covenant with his people, of the moment when civilization decided to defend itself. When we dismiss bronze as primitive, we lose all of that. We flatten 3,000 years of engineering, culture, warfare, and meaning into a single incorrect assumption. The Bronze Age lasted, in various parts of the world, from roughly 3300 BC to as late as 500 BC in some regions. That's nearly 3 millennia of human civilization built around this material. The pyramids were built with bronze tools. The Iliad describes bronze wars. The palaces of Knossos, Mycenae, and Hattusa rose and fell, while smiths refined their understanding of this alloy generation by generation. Bronze swords weren't a failed experiment on the way to something better. They were a peak, a high-water mark of what one era of human ingenuity could produce. That was replaced not because it failed, but because the world that made it possible was destroyed. The next time you see a bronze sword, in a museum, in a textbook, in a film, I want you to look at it differently. Don't see an artifact from a lesser age. See 3,000 years of metallurgical refinement. See a weapon that work-hardened its own edges, dampened impact vibration, and held a cutting edge capable of killing armored opponents at close range. See the product of trade networks that stretched from Cornwall to Afghanistan. See an object that was sacred enough to be buried with kings and offered to rivers. And see, in its replacement, not the triumph of a better technology, but the desperation of a civilization trying to survive after its world fell apart. Bronze wasn't weak. The world it came from was just too fragile to last. If this changed how you think about ancient weapons, subscribe. There's a lot more where this came from. Next time, we're looking at why Roman legions almost lost to a weapon their commanders refused to take seriously.